She never spoke a word, but somehow the entire world started listening. In the forgotten hills of Odd, West Virginia, behind walls that crumble with time and under floorboards that cry with every step, lives a woman whose silence has become louder than the chatter of millions. She has never given an interview, never uttered a sentence to the cameras, yet she became one of the most seen and misunderstood faces on the internet. Her name is Lorraine Whitaker, and her presence carries with it a story that is more haunting than anything ever said about her. The world knows her face, but not her voice. They have dissected her image, speculated about her life, gossiped about her family's history of inbreeding, but very few have stopped to consider what her silence actually means. Lorraine has become a symbol of something that people cannot explain, the way silence itself becomes a language, a presence, a form of endurance. And yet there is another truth. Lorraine Whitaker is not just the silent woman by the window. She's the byproduct of generations of choices, of isolation, of a family bound within the same walls and bound within the same blood. Hers is a disturbing story, not because of who she is, but because of the legacy that shaped her life. A life built in silence. Lorraine doesn't speak not because she is incapable, but because her silence has always spoken louder than words. She sits in the same window almost every day, her hair parted the same way, her posture stiff, her eyes carrying a presence that never fades. The house she lives in leans with age, slouching into the hills of Odd as though even the walls themselves have grown weary of standing. Inside, everything follows a rhythm of memory. The same steps across the same creaking floors, the same places where generations before her have sat, eaten, and waited for days to pass. In that stillness, Lorraine is not invisible. She is not forgotten. She is there, quietly watching, quietly existing, as if her very presence pushes back against the noise of the outside world. But for those who dare to look closer, her life is not absence, is survival. The curse of inheritance. The Whitaker family has long been labeled America's most inbred family, and while that title alone invites a mix of fascination and cruelty, the truth is not simple. In Lorraine's bloodline, repetition replaced change. Cousins became spouses, cycles looped upon themselves, and what began as quiet rural isolation hardened into a genetic prison. By the time Lorraine was born, 3 generations of Whitakers had already turned inward, their family tree folding in on itself until branches could no longer spread outward. With each generation, recessive traits once dormant and hidden had nowhere left to go. They surfaced in faces, in bodies, in voices, or in the absence of them. Lorraine's parents, Gracie and John Whitaker, were already cousins by blood. Their union, like those before them, further narrowed the gene pool, ensuring that the family's physical and mental traits would echo more strongly with each birth. Out of this spiral came Lorraine, a child born not into opportunity, but into inevitability. Her silence, her stillness, her way of being, these were not simply choices. They were the echoes of a family shaped by generations of confinement, by an inheritance that carved itself into the mind as much as the body. Life inside the house today. Lorraine lives with her siblings in the same decaying home she has known all her life. The house is more than just shelter, it is a living memory of the Whitaker family's isolation. The floors sigh under the weight of decades. The air clings with the smell of dust, old wood, and the kind of stillness that only comes when time itself seems to settle in. Lorraine communicates without words. She turns her head slightly when her name is softly spoken. She nods faintly, tilts her head, lets her eyes rest on those who address her. These are not grand gestures, but within the Whitaker home, they are enough. They are understood. In a world where speech is currency, Lorraine speaks with presence, with subtle movement, with silence that has meaning to those who live it every day. To the outside world, her lack of voice looks like emptiness. But to those who have spent enough time there, Lorraine's way of existing is as expressive as any spoken language, just slower, quieter, and shaped by an environment that never demanded anything more. The family's language. Lorraine is not the only one whose voice is absent from the air. Her siblings, too, communicate through sounds that most outsiders would never interpret as language. Rebarks, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with rhythm. Timmy hums, a soft, near-constant tone that floats through the rooms like background music. Each sound is understood within the family, each gesture seen for what it is. It is a form of communication born not from choice but from necessity. Within the Whitaker household, silence and sound coexist as a dialect of survival. Lorraine, the quietest of them all, embodies the extreme of this language: silence as expression, silence as life itself. The viral spotlight for decades, the Whitakers lived far from the eyes of the world. That changed in 2020 when filmmaker Mark Lee brought his camera into their secluded home. Suddenly, millions of strangers were staring at Lorraine's face, pausing on her stillness, wondering why she never spoke. In the viral videos, Lorraine does not acknowledge the camera. She does not perform, does not smile, does not react. She simply remains as she always has, silent and unmoved. And yet her image became iconic. To some she was haunting. To others, heartbreaking. To most, she was a mystery. But behind the fascination lay an uncomfortable truth. The world was not seeing Lorraine. They were consuming her image, projecting their assumptions onto her silence, mistaking her presence for absence. Words like mutant, creepy, and disturbing filled the comment sections of the videos. Her family became a spectacle, their dignity buried under the weight of viral curiosity. Lorraine, however, remained unchanged. She did not turn her gaze to the camera because, to her, it was nothing more than another object in a house already full of forgotten things. Misunderstood stillness to outsiders, Lorraine's stillness looks like surrender, but those who know her understand it differently. Her silence is not a void, it is a boundary, a shield, a rhythm that keeps her anchored in a world obsessed with visibility. When visitors enter the home, she rarely reacts. But when someone she knows places a hand gently on her shoulder, she leans into it, not automatically, but with understanding. She may not speak, but she knows connection. She may not use words, but she offers comfort and recognition in her own quiet way. To dismiss her as vacant is to miss the truth entirely. Lorraine lives fully, but on her own terms. Her silence is not a lack of life, but a language of endurance. The world that watches, but never sees the tragedy of Lorraine's story, is not that she does not speak, it is that the world refuses to listen to silence. In a culture that values voice, charisma, and productivity, Lorraine is dismissed as irrelevant, invisible, or tragic. But to those who look closely, she is none of these things. Her silence carries memory. Her stillness carries history. Her very existence is proof that life persists even in the most confined of circumstances. She is not frozen in time, she is fluent in a language the rest of the world has simply forgotten how to hear. The deeper cruelty, perhaps the deepest cruelty of all, is not the inbreeding that shaped Lorraine's life, nor the poverty that kept her family isolated, nor even the viral fame that turned her into a spectacle. The deepest cruelty is the indifference, the world's willingness to stare without truly seeing, to label without ever listening. Lorraine is not a ghost, she is not a symbol. She is not a warning. She is a woman who has lived through decades of isolation, poverty and unwanted attention, and who remains unchanged in the face of it all. She exists quietly, faithfully, fully, in a world that cannot comprehend her way of being. Conclusion to Part 1: Lorraine Whitaker is more than the silent face seen in viral videos. She is the embodiment of a legacy carved out by generations of inbreeding, a life shaped by isolation, and a truth that few dare to confront. Her silence is not emptiness, it is endurance. Her stillness is not surrender, it is survival. And yet, the world continues to misinterpret her, to project cruelty onto her image, to consume her without understanding. But for those patient enough to listen, Lorraine tells a story that words never could. The terrifying curse of inheritance, the quiet persistence of survival, and the haunting reality of what it means to live outside the world's idea of relevance. If Lorraine Whitaker is the quiet figure who embodies silence, then her family is the chorus that surrounds her, a group whose lives reveal the strange and disturbing legacy of generations folded back onto themselves. To truly understand Lorraine, one must step further into the Whitaker household, into the broader story of a family both ordinary and extraordinary, at once overlooked and overexposed. This is not simply a tale of one woman's stillness. It is the story of a family trapped in cycles of inheritance, isolation, and misunderstanding. And it is here, in the tangled roots of their family tree, that the so-called curse of inbreeding reveals itself in its rawest form: a house at the edge of the world. The Whitaker home in Odd, West Virginia is not just a structure of wood, brick, and peeling paint, it is a living timeline of the family's entrapment. Surrounded by narrow dirt roads, shadowy hills, and acres of overgrowth, the house feels like it belongs to another century. Electricity hums faintly. A television sits in the corner, flickering more out of habit than attention. The kitchen carries the weight of decades, pots and pans layered with history, meals prepared with the same rhythm that Lorraine follows at her window. To visitors, the house feels frozen in time. But to those who live there, it is simply life. It is not nostalgia, it is necessity. Within its walls, the Whitakers eat, sleep, hum, grunt, bark, and sit. They rarely leave, and the world rarely enters. And in that separation, an environment has formed that nurtures its own language, its own logic, its own rhythm. The generational loop in most families, time expands outward. Parents raise children who then move into the world, marry, and bring in new blood, new traditions, new stories. But in the Whitaker family, time folded inward. Generations did not expand, they repeated, cousins became spouses. The same faces reappeared in different combinations. The same names cycled through like echoes. By the time Lorraine was born, this looping had gone on for 3 generations. What that meant was more than physical resemblance, it was the compression of possibility. Genes that might have been diluted through diversity instead collided and reinforced. Recessive traits, quirks, conditions, vulnerabilities emerged with startling clarity. The Whitakers became living evidence of what happens when isolation narrows choice. They were not monsters, not grotesque curiosities. They were human beings caught in a closed circle, repeating themselves until the repetition became its own kind of prison. The sibling symphony. Lorraine is the quietest of the Whitakers, but she is not alone in her silence. Her siblings form a spectrum of expression, each communicating in ways outsiders rarely understand. Ray, the most vocal, expresses himself through sudden bursts of barking. To strangers it is jarring, even frightening. To his family, it is language and alert, a reaction, a statement of presence. Timmy hums, producing a near-constant vibration of sound that threads through the house. His hums are soft, almost melodic, and serve as both comfort and continuity. Others communicate through grunts, gestures, or stillness, their bodies carrying the memory of a language that exists only within the home. To outsiders, this chorus of nonverbal communication looks like dysfunction. But inside the family, it is a fluent system, as natural to them as conversation is to others. It is survival shaped into sound and silence. The world's intrusion for decades, the Whitakers lived almost entirely removed from the outside world. Their isolation was not just geographic, it was cultural, economic, and social. Poverty pressed them into corners where options narrowed. Isolation compounded the narrowing. And in that stillness, their family line looped back on itself again and again. Then came 2020. Filmmaker Mark Lee entered their home with a camera, and suddenly, the Whitakers were no longer invisible. Their faces, their sounds, their silences were broadcast to millions across the internet. What had been a private, insular rhythm became public spectacle. The videos went viral. Millions of viewers stared at Lorraine's still face, at Ree's barking, at Timmy's humming. Donations poured in, along with food, clothes, and money. But so did the crueler side of curiosity, mockery, labeling, and dehumanization. Words like mutant and creepy flooded the comments. For every viewer who saw tragedy, there were 10 who saw entertainment. Lorraine, as always, remained unmoved. She did not acknowledge the camera. She did not perform. She simply existed as she always had, but the intrusion altered the dynamic. For the first time, the Whitakers were being consumed by the outside world, not as people, but as content, exploitation or exposure. The arrival of cameras raised an uncomfortable question. Was this exposure help or was it exploitation? On one hand, the attention brought the family resources they had never received before. Donations improved their living conditions. Their story reached people who otherwise would have never known they existed. On the other hand, the lens lingered. It zoomed into deformities, paused on silences, stretched stillness into discomfort. The camera turned their existence into something to be gawked at, dissected, and shared. The family who had lived for generations unseen now lived in a distorted visibility. Mark Lee claimed his goal was to humanize the forgotten, but the internet rarely humanizes. It commodifies. Lorraine and her siblings became icons, memes, symbols, anything but people. The curse beyond genetics. To call the Whitakers cursed by inbreeding is to oversimplify. Genetics alone do not explain the weight of their lives. The curse is broader: poverty that isolates, geography that traps, history that repeats, and a society that ignores until it sees a spectacle. The Whitakers are not anomalies of biology, they are outcomes of environment. Their silence, their expressions, their ways of being are shaped by generations of circumstance as much as by DNA. Lorraine, the stillest of them all, embodies this curse most visibly. She is not voiceless, her silence is her voice. But the world, addicted to noise, cannot hear it. What the siblings reveal about Lorraine to understand Lorraine is to see her in context. She is not simply the silent woman by the window. She is part of a collective, each member of which reflects a fragment of what she carries inside. Where Ray barks, Lorraine stays still. Where Timmy hums, Lorraine tilts her head. Where others grunt or gesture, Lorraine gazes. Together they form a chorus of survival, each contributing to a language outsiders cannot translate. Lorraine's silence is not emptiness, is the final note in a family symphony that outsiders mistake for noise. A day in the Whitaker home. To step into the Whitaker home is to enter a rhythm entirely its own. Morning comes not with alarm clocks or schedules, but with light filtering through sagging curtains. Lorraine sits by her window. Timmy hums softly in the background. Ray barks when strangers approach. Meals are shared quietly, plates passed, gestures exchanged, heads nodded. The television hums but is rarely watched. The walls groan with memory. The floorboards creak with familiarity. Visitors come and go, some bearing food, others cameras, many curiosity. Lorraine remains unchanged. It is not a glamorous life, not a tragic one, it is simply life, lived within boundaries the world cannot comprehend. Conclusion to Part 2. The Whitaker family is not a horror story, though the internet often frames them that way. They are not villains, nor spectacles, nor curiosities. They are a family whose history of isolation and inbreeding has created a way of life both haunting and ordinary, disturbing and human. Lorraine is the quiet face of this legacy, the one who has been most watched yet least understood. To see her is to see silence not as failure but as endurance. To know her is to recognize that the true curse of inbreeding is not simply genetic, it is generational, environmental, and societal. In her stillness, Lorraine reveals something terrifying not about herself, but about us, our obsession with noise, our cruelty toward difference, our inability to listen when silence speaks. And this is only the beginning. For to truly understand Lorraine Whitaker, we must dive deeper, not only into her silence, but into the long, winding history that shaped her family and the uncomfortable mirror it holds up to the rest of the world. For most of her life, Lorraine Whitaker existed in the background, unnoticed except by those who lived within the four walls of her decaying home in Odd, West Virginia. But in 2020, the background became the stage. A single lens captured her stillness, her siblings' sounds, her family's way of being, and overnight, millions of strangers were staring at what had once been hidden. The world did not hear Lorraine's voice. It did not even hear her silence. Instead, it projected meaning onto her image, turned her life into content, and mistook her survival for spectacle. The viral wave. The videos uploaded by filmmaker Mark Lee spread faster than wildfire. They showed Lorraine at her window, her siblings humming or barking, her family moving about the house in their own quiet rhythm. To the Whitakers, this was simply life. To the internet, it was something alien. Millions clicked, millions commented, millions shared. Overnight, Lorraine became one of the most seen faces online, yet still one of the least understood. For many viewers, the footage was shocking. The silence, the gestures, the deformities shaped by generations of inbreeding, these became points of fascination, even horror. For others, the videos elicited sympathy, a sense of tragedy, a desire to help, and for far too many, they became entertainment. Words like mutant, creepy, and disturbing filled comment sections. Reaction videos sprouted across platforms. Memes circulated. Lorraine and her family became characters in a story written by people who had never met them, never listened to them, never seen them beyond the screen. The price of visibility for the Whitakers, the sudden spotlight, was a paradox. Donations began arriving: food, clothes, money that eased the strain of poverty. Strangers traveled to Odd just to glimpse the family whose silence had become famous. The home that had been forgotten for decades was now buzzing with visitors, supplies, and cameras. But with visibility came vulnerability. The Whitakers were not celebrated as individuals. They were consumed as curiosities. Their humanity was overshadowed by their image. The world looked, but it did not see. Lorraine, as always, remained unmoved. She did not acknowledge the lens. She did not alter her rhythm. Her silence became both shield and burden, protecting her from the chaos yet forcing the world to fill the void with its own projections, exploitation or empathy. The Internet's obsession with the Whitakers raised a haunting question. Was this exposure an act of compassion or an act of exploitation? Mark Lee insisted his goal was to humanize the forgotten, to shine light on a family left behind by society. And to some degree he succeeded. The world knew their names, their faces, their conditions. The Whitakers were no longer invisible. But the camera is never neutral. Its gaze lingers, its edits emphasize, its silence becomes amplified. By zooming into deformities, by stretching stillness into discomfort, the footage risked dehumanizing the very people it sought to portray. Was Lorraine a woman, or was she content? Was her silence respected, or was it commodified? The answers depended not only on the filmmaker, but on the millions who consumed the images. The Internet's mirror Lorraine's story is not just about her, it's about us. The way society reacted to her silence revealed more about the world outside the Whitaker home than about Lorraine herself. Fascination. Many stared because they could not look away, as though witnessing a living relic of something forbidden or taboo. Fear. Some saw her as unsettling, a reminder of what happens when isolation and inbreeding collapse possibility. Mockery. Others laughed, dehumanizing her with cruel labels, reducing her existence to entertainment. Sympathy. A fraction responded with compassion, offering donations and prayers. But almost none truly listened. Silence, after all, is difficult to hear in a world addicted to noise. Lorraine's stillness demanded patience, demanded presence, demanded humility. Most viewers gave her none of these things. Stigma in stillness. The stigma that surrounds Lorraine is not only about her silence, but about what people think her silence means. To many outsiders, it signifies emptiness, vacancy, lack of life. Yet those who know her see something else entirely. They see how she leans gently when someone she trusts touches her shoulder. They see the way she turns her head when her name is called. They see the subtle shifts of expression, the quiet awareness, the presence that cannot be captured by cruel words. Her silence is not absence, is a different language. But society is illiterate in silence. It cannot translate stillness. And so, it mocks what it does not understand. The ethics of looking. There is an old question in documentary filmmaking: does the camera reveal or does it exploit? With the Whitakers, this question became painfully sharp. The footage brought attention to a family living in extreme isolation, offering a glimpse into lives most would never otherwise see. Yet at the same time, it turned private existence into public spectacle. The Whitakers never asked for fame. Lorraine never asked for an audience. And yet their lives became property of the Internet, dissected by strangers who saw them as characters rather than people. The ethics are complicated. Perhaps the exposure brought material help, but at what cost? Dignity cannot be donated, privacy cannot be replaced. The human zoo. Some critics began to describe the Whitakers' situation as a human zoo. Strangers traveled to Odd, West Virginia, not to offer compassion, but to satisfy curiosity. They wanted photos, videos, stories to share. They wanted to say they had seen the Whitakers in person, as though checking an item off a list. Inside the home, life continued as it always had. Lorraine sat by her window. Timmy hummed. Ray barked. Meals were prepared and eaten. But outside, the family's name became shorthand for oddity, for deformity, for spectacle. The Whitakers were no longer hidden, but in many ways they had never been more unseen. Silence as resistance in this storm of visibility, Lorraine's silence became something powerful, even defiant. By refusing to perform, by refusing to acknowledge the lens, she denied the internet the satisfaction of reaction. Her silence was not just survival, it was resistance. She was not frozen, she was not passive. She was fluent in a language most had forgotten, and by remaining silent she spoke volumes. She reminded the world that not everything exists for consumption, that not every story needs explanation, that not every life requires a narrative arc. Her silence carved out a boundary that no camera could cross. The deeper curse, the terrifying curse of inbreeding, is not only written in the Whitakers' genes, it is written in how society responds to them. The physical legacies of repetition are visible, yes, but the deeper curse is the cruelty of others, the stigma that isolates further, the gaze that consumes without compassion. Lorraine is not cursed by her silence. She is cursed by the world's inability to hear it. The Internet's forgotten lesson, the story of Lorraine Whitaker, is not, at its core, about deformity or silence or inbreeding. It is about endurance. It is about what happens when the world, obsessed with noise and visibility, encounters someone who refuses to play its game. Millions stared, millions judged. But in the end, Lorraine remained unchanged. Her silence did not bend to curiosity. Her stillness did not fracture under mockery. She simply endured as she always had in the quiet rhythm of her life. The Internet learned nothing, perhaps because it was never truly listening. But Lorraine's silence remains, waiting for those brave enough to hear. Conclusion to Part 3. When Lorraine Whitaker became a viral figure, the world mistook her silence for spectacle. It projected fear, fascination, and mockery onto her stillness, consuming her as content rather than respecting her as a person. Yet through it all, she remained unmoved. Her silence is not absence, it is endurance. Not performance, but presence. Not weakness, but resistance. And that is what makes her story so disturbing, not that she is silent, but that the world cannot comprehend silence. The curse of inbreeding may have shaped her life, but the curse of society is what turned her life into a spectacle. The haunting truth is not that Lorraine Whitaker does not speak. It is that we, as a world, no longer know how to listen. Lorraine Whitaker has lived her entire life in the shadows of Appalachia, in a home that leans with age and memory, surrounded by siblings whose voices are more gesture than sound. She has been seen by millions, yet heard by none. She has been judged, mocked, pitied, and mythologized, but never truly known. Her story is disturbing, not because of who she is, but because of what it reveals about inheritance, about poverty, about society's hunger for spectacle. To look at Lorraine is to confront not only the curse of inbreeding, but the deeper curses of indifference, cruelty, and misunderstanding. The weight of history. The Whitakers did not emerge in a vacuum. They are the result of generations shaped by isolation, poverty, and geography. In rural Appalachia, entire communities have lived for centuries cut off from broader society. Roads are narrow, opportunities are scarce. Families cling to land, to each other, to survival. In such places, family trees sometimes circle back on themselves. Cousins marry cousins not out of malice but out of necessity, because choices are few, because leaving is difficult, because poverty closes doors before they can even be opened. Over time, this repetition becomes inheritance. Traits once harmless resurface. Genes collide. And with each generation, the margin for difference narrows. Lorraine was born into such a spiral. By the time she arrived, 3 generations of repetition had already taken root. Her parents, themselves cousins, continued the cycle, and Lorraine's silence became the most visible outcome of choices made long before her birth. Silence as survival. It is tempting to view Lorraine's silence as tragedy. But silence can also be survival. Within her family, silence is not absence but a form of expression. Lorraine communicates through eye movements, head tilts, Slight gestures, signals that are clear to those who live alongside her. Her silence protects her from a world that does not understand. It shields her from exploitation, from interrogation, from the cruelty of voices that mock what they do not comprehend. Silence is her language, her shield, her form of endurance. And in that silence lies a haunting lesson. Not all survival requires sound. Not all presence requires performance. The internet's gaze when the world discovered the Whitakers through viral videos. Lorraine's silence was magnified into something alien. Millions stared at her face, paused on her stillness, dissected her existence as though it were a puzzle to be solved. But Lorraine never asked to be watched. She never invited the gaze. The internet turned her life into a mirror reflecting society's obsession with difference, its fear of deformity, its hunger for spectacle. Words like creepy and mutant replaced empathy. Reaction videos turned her silence into entertainment. Visitors came not to connect, but to consume. And yet, through it all, Lorraine remained unchanged. She did not flinch. She did not respond. She endured, as she always had, in silence. Beyond genetics. To reduce Lorraine's life to genetics alone is to miss the broader truth. Yes, inbreeding shaped her family. Yes, generations of repeated unions narrowed the possibilities of their bloodline. But genetics alone cannot explain the weight of her story. The real curse lies in isolation, in poverty that limits choice, in geography that traps families within valleys and hollows, in a society that turns its back until curiosity strikes. Lorraine's silence is not simply genetic, it is generational. It is environmental. It is historical. The Whitakers are not monsters. They are human beings shaped by forces larger than themselves. Their way of life is not an experiment in biology, it is a mirror of neglect, of what happens when communities are abandoned to poverty and repetition. What Lorraine represents, Lorraine's story, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that poverty and isolation are as dangerous as any gene. That silence is not emptiness, but expression in a world that no longer listens. That society prefers to mock what it fears rather than understand it. That human dignity can survive even when visibility is stripped away. She is not a ghost. She is not a symbol. She is not a warning. Lorraine Whitaker is a woman who has lived through decades of hardship, judgment, and unwanted attention, and has remained herself through it all. Her life is not glamorous. It is not tragic in the way outsiders want it to be. It is simply life, lived in a rhythm the world cannot translate. The disturbing truth of Lorraine Whitaker's story is not the deformities born of inbreeding, nor the silence that defines her presence. It is the way the world responds to her. The true curse is not her genetics but our gaze, the way society consumes difference, mocks silence, and mistakes endurance for emptiness. Lorraine's stillness is not terrifying. What is terrifying is the mirror she holds up, that we, in our hunger for spectacle, cannot sit quietly long enough to understand another human being. A legacy of silence. Lorraine will likely never give an interview, never speak a word into a microphone, never explain herself, and she does not need to. Her silence has already told the story. It has revealed the weight of inheritance, the cruelty of stigma, the persistence of survival. Her life is not a tragedy, not a warning, but a reminder. A reminder that some people exist not to explain, not to entertain, but to endure. A reminder that life does not need permission to be real. And perhaps, in the end, that is Lorraine's legacy, not the terrifying curse of inbreeding, not the spectacle of silence, but the stubborn truth that dignity can survive even in the most haunting of circumstances. Conclusion to Part 4. The world may never hear Lorraine Whitaker speak, but it has already heard her silence. Her story is disturbing, yes, but not because of who she is. It is disturbing because of what it reveals about us. Our cruelty, our curiosity, our inability to see beyond spectacle. Lorraine's life is a mirror. In it, we see the consequences of isolation, the persistence of survival, and the failure of a society that mistakes silence for absence. She does not need to explain herself. She does not need to be understood. She simply exists, and that existence alone is enough to unsettle the world. You've just heard the story of Lorraine Whitaker, a woman who never spoke, yet told the world more in silence than most do in a lifetime. Her stillness is not emptiness, but endurance. Her life is not a spectacle, but a mirror. If this story moved you, share her name. Let Lorraine be remembered not as an image to mock, but as a reminder that every life carries meaning, even when the world refuses to listen. Do you believe silence can be more powerful than words? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. You've just heard the story of Lorraine Whitaker, a woman who never spoke, yet told the world more in silence than most do in a lifetime. Her stillness is not emptiness, but endurance. Her life is not a spectacle, but a mirror. If this story moved you, share her name. Let Lorraine be remembered not as an image to mock, but as a reminder that every life carries meaning, even when the world refuses to listen. Do you believe silence can be more powerful than words? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths.